Sarah was 24 years old. She wore a faded dress, one of those that had lost its color from so much washing, and in one hand she carried a cardboard suitcase that barely closed. Beside her walked a honey-colored dog that everyone had rejected. They threw her out of her own house one scorching morning, and she walked aimlessly down a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere, until, among the tall bushes, she spotted an old abandoned property. The house seemed forgotten by God and by the world. There was no one there. There was no food. There was nothing except aged walls and a silence as heavy as lead. In that place, where anyone would have wanted to sit down, cry, and go back, Sarah decided to stay. She did not know whose land it was. She did not know how she would survive. Nor did she know that this house held secrets capable of changing her life forever. Write down below, from where you are watching this video, tell us your city and your state. We are very happy to know that our stories reach the farthest corners. And if this story touches your heart, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories. In the lost villages among streams, dirt roads, and forgotten fields, stories like this used to be told. Sarah woke up that morning without imagining it would be the last time she would sleep under that roof. The sun was barely beginning to rise when Elias, her stepfather, banged his fist on the door of the little room at the back of the house, just as he had always done since she was a child, with that violence that made her heart leap inside her chest. Elias was a man of few words, but the few he spoke sounded like a sentence. He told her she was too old now to keep living there, eating for free. He said Darla needed that room to store her things, and that it was time for Sarah to leave and manage on her own like an adult woman. Sarah looked at him, searching in that man's eyes for some remnant of tenderness, some memory of the years she had looked after that house, cooking, washing, ironing, and working as if she were two people, without ever receiving a simple thank you. But she found nothing. She only saw the cold haste of someone who wants to get rid of a burden. Sarah's mother had died when she was 9 years old. It all started with a mild fever that, in a few days, took away the only person who had truly loved her in this world. Elias was not her blood father. He was the man her mother had brought home when Sarah was still a baby. After the funeral, it was clear that he tolerated the girl only because he needed someone to keep the house running. That was how Sarah grew up, between the stove and the laundry tub, learning to silently swallow the tiredness and the loneliness. She never went to school. She never had a new dress. She never heard anyone tell her she was important. The only valuable thing her mother had left her, besides a small image of the Virgin Mary, was the ability to read. Before getting sick, she had taught her to join syllables, to recognize her own name, and to slowly decipher words on labels and notes. That small inheritance stayed inside Sarah like a seed that still doesn't know where it will sprout. When Darla appeared, a woman with a loud laugh and an icy stare, and began to treat Sarah as if she were a piece of old furniture cluttering the house, the girl understood that her days there were numbered. But she never imagined that everything would end like this, with a cardboard suitcase in her hand and a door closing behind her back. Before the coffee cooled, Darla came out to the veranda. Sarah was going down the steps with the suitcase when the woman stood there with her arms crossed, with a smile utterly devoid of kindness. She said nothing. There was no need. Her silence was harsher than any insult. Sarah tightened her grip on the suitcase handle and walked down the dirt street of the small town. She felt the hot earth under her worn sandals and carried in her chest the weight of someone who has nowhere to go. Then she heard footsteps behind her, and she turned around. Buddy, the dog, was running toward her, kicking up dust with his paws, his tongue out and his eyes full of that loyalty only dogs know. Elias shouted from the door to take that animal too, that he wasn't going to waste food on a useless dog. Buddy caught up to Sarah and pressed his muzzle against her leg, panting as if to say, "Wherever you go, I go with you." Sarah crouched down, stroked the honey-colored dog's head, and felt her eyes burning. At least someone in this world had chosen her. They walked for hours under a merciless sun. The town was left behind, and the dirt road crossed a dry landscape of golden grasses, crooked fences, and twisted trees that seemed to pray to the sky. Sarah didn't know where she was going. She knew no one anywhere. She had no money in her pocket and no plan in her head. She only carried a suitcase with 3 changes of clothes, a comb, a piece of soap, her birth certificate, and the small image of the Virgin Mary that her mother had left her, its paint already worn by time. Every now and then, a cart passed in the distance, but Sarah didn't ask for a ride. She was ashamed to explain where she was heading, because the truth was she wasn't heading anywhere. Buddy walked beside her without complaint, sometimes stopping to sniff some bushes and then coming back running, always close, always faithful, as if he understood that now they only had each other. The sun was already beginning to set when Sarah saw a narrow path branching off from the main road, almost hidden among the tall weeds. Something made her stop. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was an instinct she couldn't explain, or maybe it was God guiding the steps of someone who no longer knew how to walk alone. Buddy went into the path first, sniffing the ground with curiosity, and Sarah followed him, pushing branches aside with one hand and holding the suitcase with the other. They walked about 500 meters along that path covered in weeds until the vegetation started to open up and a clearing appeared. There, silent like a wound hidden for years, stood an old country house, of a southern style, with a tile roof, worn columns, and walls that had once been white. The wooden fence around it was crooked and broken in several places. The vines had invaded almost everything, climbing up the walls and covering what must once have been a clean yard. There was no light, no voices, no signs that anyone had set foot in that place for a very long time. Sarah stood still, looking at the house. Her heart was beating hard, and in her chest she felt a strange mix of fear and something akin to hope. She pushed what was left of the old gate and slowly approached the entrance. The door was ajar, unlocked. When she pushed it, the wood let out a long creak that spread through the silence of the evening. Inside, it smelled of dampness and of time standing still. The golden sunlight came in through glassless windows and illuminated a room with a wooden floor covered in dust, dry leaves, and cobwebs. Against one wall, there was an old table, 2 overturned chairs, and in the corner, a wood burning stove that seemed sturdy despite the years. Sarah left the suitcase on the floor and walked through the whole house. There were 2 small rooms with iron beds without mattresses, a kitchen with empty shelves, and a backyard where the weeds grew so tall you couldn't see what was beyond. Everything was abandoned. Everything was forgotten, everything seemed frozen in time, as if the owner had left one day and never returned. Buddy sniffed every corner, every crack, every shadow. Then he came back to Sarah and lay down at her feet, calm, as if he approved of the place. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching the sky turn orange and violet. For the first time since she had left Elias's house, she breathed deeply, truly. She did not know whose property it was. She did not know if the next day someone would appear to throw her out again. She did not know how she would eat, how she would keep warm, how she would survive there with nothing. But one thing she did know, with a certainty so strong it hurt in her chest, she was not going back. She would not return to Elias's house. She would not beg anyone for a roof. She would not allow anyone to decide for her what she deserved and what she didn't. If this house was empty and abandoned, then it was perfect. Because she was too. That first night was the hardest of her life. Without food, without fire, without a blanket, lying on the wooden floor, with the suitcase as a pillow and Buddy curled up against her belly, trying to give her the warmth the early morning cold wanted to steal. Her stomach rumbled with hunger. The sounds of the night frightened someone who had never slept alone in the middle of the countryside. There were owls, crickets, branches that creaked, and a wind that slipped through the open windows as if whispering things she could not understand. Sarah prayed quietly the prayer her mother had taught her, pressed the image of the Virgin Mary against her chest, and asked God for strength to hold on at least one more day. Just one. Then another, and then another. She fell asleep listening to Buddy's constant breathing, with hunger gnawing at her insides. When the sun rose and the first rays came in through the glassless window, Sarah opened her eyes and stayed lying down, looking at the dark wooden ceiling where a lizard was running after an insect. Her whole body ached from the hard floor. Her mouth was dry. Hunger was a hole in the middle of her chest. But she was alive. She was whole. And that old, cracked ceiling, however it might be, did not belong to anyone who could shout at her to leave. She got up slowly, rubbed her eyes, and went out to the backyard. Buddy followed her, glued to her heels. The weeds were tall and thick, but in the middle of that green chaos, Sarah saw something that made her heart leap. There was an old mango tree with a thick, twisted trunk, and under its branches lay ripe, yellow, perfumed fruits, some split open by the sun. Sarah picked a mango up from the ground, cleaned it with the edge of her dress, and bit into the flesh. The sweet juice ran down her chin. She closed her eyes and felt that flavor as if it were the best meal of her life. Because, in that moment, it was. That was her first victory in that place. The land was speaking to her in that quiet language with which the land speaks. It was telling her, here there is life. Here you can stay. Here you can try. That morning, she ate 3 mangoes and shared pieces with Buddy, who swallowed them with a dog's simple joy. Then she sat under the old tree, looking at the house with different eyes. She no longer saw ruins. She saw possibilities. She heard a stream running somewhere nearby. She saw guava trees hidden among the weeds. She saw dark earth in the backyard, fertile under all that neglect. She saw the wood-burning stove that could work again if she could start a fire. And for the first time in a long time, she saw a future that depended only on her own hands. It wasn't a pretty future yet. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't safe. But it was hers, and that was enough. Sarah stood up, dusted off her dress, rolled up her sleeves, and began. The first thing she needed was fire. Without fire, there would be no hot food, no boiled water, no light when night fell. She vaguely remembered how her mother lit the stove by striking stones to get a spark, but Sarah had never done it alone. She gathered dry leaves and fine twigs and placed them inside the wood stove in the kitchen, and she spent the whole morning trying to make fire with 2 stones she found in the yard. Her hands hurt from striking them together over and over without result. She tried with finer straw, blue in different ways, even tried rubbing one stick against another as she had once seen someone do. Nothing. Frustration fell over her like a wave. She sat on the kitchen floor, her hands trembling and her eyes full of tears. Buddy came closer and put his head on her knees, as if wanting to tell her that making mistakes was also allowed. It was there, with the dog on her lap and the shame of not being able to do something so basic, that Sarah understood that surviving alone would demand a patience she had never had to learn before. She tried again. This time, she changed the method. Instead of striking the stones with desperation, she started scraping one against the other with a firmer, more controlled motion. Suddenly, a spark jumped and fell onto the dry straw. Sarah blew carefully, protecting that red point with her cup hands. She felt a weak heat, and she trembled with emotion. The straw caught fire, then a little twig, then the thin kindling. And when the first steady flame rose inside the old stove, Sarah shouted with joy. The shout scared the birds from the mango tree. Buddy barked alongside her, infected by her excitement. The 2 of them stood watching the fire grow, as if it were the most beautiful thing in the world. And in that instant, it was. It was proof that Sarah could learn, could do, could endure. She boiled water in an old pot she found at the back of a cupboard and drank it hot, feeling the liquid go down her dry throat. There was no sugar, no coffee, just clean, hot water, and yet it was more than she had had the night before. On the second day, Sarah followed the sound of water she had been hearing since her arrival. She walked through the weeds behind the house with Buddy running ahead, sniffing everything. After about 200 meters of thick vegetation, she found what she was looking for, a narrow stream of clear water running over smooth stones under trees that formed a kind of green tunnel. The water was so clear you could see the little stones on the bottom and small silver fish moving among them. Sarah knelt on the bank, put her hands in the water, and brought it to her face. It was cold, sweet, clean. She drank until she felt her stomach full. Then she stayed there, listening to the murmur of the current, and for the first time since leaving Elias's house, she felt something close to peace. Buddy got into the stream and stood with his paws in the water, trying to catch the little fish that passed by and failing every time. Sarah laughed. She laughed truly, freely. The laugh came from the bottom of her chest and spread among the trees. It had been so long since she had laughed that the sound almost scared her. Food was still the most urgent problem. Mangoes kept her on her feet, but Sarah knew she couldn't live on fruit alone. She needed something more substantial, something that would fill her body and give her energy for the work that awaited her. Buddy solved the first part of that problem. On the third day, he disappeared into the brush for almost an hour and came back with a dead wild rabbit between his teeth, dropping it at Sarah's feet with a hunter's pride. She looked at the little animal and her stomach turned, because she had never skinned anything in her life. But hunger was stronger than disgust. She remembered seeing Elias prepare animals in the yard of the house and tried to imitate him with an old, rusty knife she found in a kitchen drawer. She did it clumsily, slowly, getting her hands dirty. But at the end of the day, she had meat roasting over the fire. The smell filled the house. Buddy lay down by the kitchen door, waiting for his share with eyes bright with anticipation. That night, Sarah ate meat for the first time in 3 days and shared half with the dog. Sometimes, God puts things in a person's path in the most unexpected way, and sometimes that way comes on 4 paws, with a tail that won't stop wagging. During the first week, Sarah explored everything the property offered. Besides the mango, she found 2 guava trees loaded with fruit, a wild vine tangled in the old fence, edible herbs in a corner of the yard, and a slender papaya tree with green fruits at the top. Sarah spent hours leafing through that notebook, trying to decipher the old handwriting, which in some places had run where the ink was poor. Whoever wrote it knew a lot about the land, about plants, and about the secrets that nature keeps for those who have the patience to learn. There was no name, no date, only knowledge from someone who had lived there and wanted to leave it all recorded so it wouldn't be lost. At the bottom of the box, under everything else, Sarah found a rag doll dressed in a printed fabric, now faded, with black wool hair. A girl's doll, hand-stitched with firm, loving stitches. In that moment, Sarah understood that whoever had lived there had not been just any person. It had been a woman who knew the land, who perhaps had a daughter or a granddaughter, and who, for some reason Sarah didn't yet know, had left, leaving behind what was most dear. A doll, a notebook, and seeds, as if she had fled in a hurry, or as if she had had no choice. The third week brought Mrs. Fern. Sarah was in the backyard, pulling weeds around the fruit trees, when she heard Buddy barking in front of the house. It wasn't an aggressive, danger bark, but that short bark of curiosity. Sarah went there and saw an old woman on the other side of the fence, leaning on a wooden cane. She wore a wide straw hat that covered part of her face. Her dark skin was marked by wrinkles from decades under the sun. She might have been 70 years old, perhaps more, but her eyes were still alive and attentive, like those of an owl. From her arm hung a basket covered with a cotton cloth. The woman looked at Sarah in silence for a moment and then said she had seen smoke coming out of the chimney and that for many, many years, no one had lit a fire in their house. Sarah felt her body go cold with fear. She thought the woman was the owner of